You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hi, Jack.
Hey, Steve. How you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
Great. Thanks for coming into the Valley Current. We're trying to figure out what's happening in the world of fraud because one thing after another keeps playing out, and there must be a trend here or a pattern here that suggests that maybe we're at the height of excess or the height of some pinnacle. I'm not quite sure what it is, but between the convictions of both Elizabeth Holmes and her COO, Sunny Balwani, and the jail time that she was given, some, I guess, over 11 years, and I imagine he's going to get even a longer sentence, and now the restitution process where there's some evaluation of what was the total amount of the fraud and how much can actually be recovered, presumably from each of them jointly and severally. But we also have in the midst of this FTX implosion and what seems like a number of executives who are confessing to not necessarily understanding their own business, to put it mildly. I don't know if that gets them out from being fraudsters or if that's actually what the truthful story is. I know you're watching all this stuff. So what's your take on what's going on from a really big picture point of view?
I agree with everything that you just said. I'm personally also concerned as a parent by the example set by ex-President Trump and all the litigation against him. And there may be elements of fraud there. How can I teach my child to be an honest, law-abiding person with all these questionable examples of ethics?
Oh, yeah. You're saying at the very top of American leadership, maybe you could argue this is the generation that follows the Y2K generation, the run-up that happened in 1998 and 1999 and the dot-com explosion. These are the kids or the next generation that sort of watch that play out as young as children or students, and then they wanted to get on essentially the same fast train to make the same sort of exorbitant amounts of money, and they're willing to do or push just about every envelope out there to make that happen. And maybe that's the big picture in some sense of the word.
Jack, I'm very reluctant to join in generational stereotypes. I think that everybody is unique. As professionals, you and I have had extensive training on professional ethics. And for example, I highly doubt that you or I would steal from clients or commingle substantial client funds with firm funds in the way that FTX appears to have done. I was distraught seeing a comment by Sam, the gentleman who founded FTX, saying that if he'd only waited an extra 8 minutes before signing the bankruptcy, that an additional $8 billion in equity funds would have been received and used to patch client losses. It just disturbs me that the same lack of controls that caused this mess in the first place is now being considered by this person as a potential remedy to solve the problem in the 9th hour or the 99th hour. It seems like nothing has been learned that client funds should not be mingled with firm funds. If you look at the FINRA rules or any other country's rules concerning handling of client funds, it's just not permitted. So was there a regulatory failure?
Yeah, I mean, obviously people are going to be asking and business cases are going to be studied and law cases are going to be analyzed. The gentleman is the former CEO now, Sam Bankman-Fried. Funny name, Bankman-Fried. I guess his parents are professors at Stanford, so he comes from a fairly well-educated family. And this story is an amazing just a meteoric sort of ride of a company's growth over the last 3 or so years to a valuation that was even larger than Theranos. At least with Theranos, the rise was sort of a long sort of 10 plus year period of time from pure startup to what became a company at its height, I guess, that was worth at least $9 billion, or at least that's what the report is. And there were activities, there were employees. It's a relatively small group of people located in, the news reports are Bermuda. Someone recently told me, no, it's Barbados. I'm not sure. Somewhere in that neck of the island chains that are considered to be tax havens just outside the United States is where they were operating this business with a relatively small group of people for what was a business valued at some $32 billion. I think they only had about 30 employees. I mean, it's a pretty amazing story that you can, in 3 years, grow a business from zero to over 30 billion, and from zero or one founder to 30 or so people, and have that kind of rise in value. I mean, that in itself is a story that seems hard to believe. And obviously, in the course of that, there are all these issues of controls not being in place, right?
Yes. Apparently, there was no accounting department, and apparently no internal CPA involved, and no CFO that I can find in the media reports. In terms of the distinction between, clearly there's a failure and there may have been theft or fraud. As a CPA, I've been required to memorize the elements of fraud. And from what I found, there's 7 elements. A intentional material misrepresentation, rightful reliance on the misrepresentation by the victims, and consequential damages.
Right.
And the first of these is intent. And so as an attorney watching this, have you seen signs that there was in fact intentional fraud by one or more people?
Yeah, I think intent gets examined in a few different ways. One of the, one way is at a standard that's not like a malice type of intent, that this whole thing was just a game and a gimmick and it can never work, but more of like a recklessness standard, because these business models are new, and the approach to financing them really in many ways depends upon the psychology of the folks that are putting money, real dollars, real currency into a different type of currency called a cryptocurrency. And they're believing that there's going to be appreciation. They're also believing that they're going to get certain monthly yield payments on effectively their investment in a form of unregistered securities. Now, there's a big debate going on. Are they really securities? Are they really something different from securities? Should they be regulated by the SEC? Should they be regulated by the CFTC? Is it more like a commodity than a security? There's a lot of back and forth. But by and large, I think most people have settled on the view that if it's providing a yield, it is a security and it is governed by the SEC rules. And if you are issuing an unregistered security, it has to be only to an accredited investor, which is someone who can presumably afford the loss. They have a certain net worth, they have a certain amount of income every year. There's definitions for accredited investors. And I imagine that probably is where they're going to find some violations right off the bat. Now, there were lots of these investors located overseas, and generally the securities laws in the U.S. do not necessarily protect overseas investors. It would have to be the securities laws of those overseas jurisdictions where the investors are located that would protect them. But in some instances, and I've been told a big chunk of the money came from Chinese investors. And I'm not sure whether the Chinese regulatory authorities are going to care about rich billionaires or multimillionaires in China choosing to put their money into FTX or into some type of FTX product, if you want to call what they provide a product or security, as something that that the Chinese authorities are going to do something about. But we're starting to see litigation. We're starting to see class action litigation. It's already been filed in 2, 3, or 4 different federal courts, by different firms, all seeking to eventually control what will probably be different classes of claimants, all pursuing monies that, in many ways, the question is, where did this money go? Like, where did this ultimate cash money end up? It couldn't have just totally evaporated, right? The money went into some accounts and is presumably going to get traced. I mean, I can't imagine what that audit work is going to look like once all the tracing is done, but I assume it's going to trace into other investments, other entities, other funds, other assets. And even though there's a bankruptcy filing, that doesn't mean, of course, that there are no assets. There may well be a pretty substantial number of assets that just have to be located and controlled by presumably the U.S. bankruptcy court's jurisdiction. But I think there's even a jurisdictional fight as to whether the bankruptcy happens in the U.S. or the bankruptcy happens under the laws of either Bermuda, Barbados, or whatever country FTX actually operated in. I think it's Bermuda, at least that's what or somewhere. Maybe it's the Bahamas, and maybe it's Barbados in the Bahamas, if that's the right way to put it. But it's quite a messy story. And it sounds like you saw an interview where he said, oh, if I just had another 8 million, I could have, or if I just had another 8 minutes, I had 8 billion coming in that could have fixed all this.
Yes, I sent you a link to that interview.
Wow.
I was appalled by that interview because it just expressed his intent, speaking to the intent component of fraud, to continue to potentially use equity to commingle equity money with client money. And that interview was very telling to me in terms of the intent component of fraud. As a broker-dealer, I think that FTX was not only an issuer, potentially subject to SEC rules, as you touched on, but potentially also a broker-dealer operating or doing business in the USA and subject to FINRA regulation. And I took a look at the FINRA webpage with a list of regulated companies, and there was an FTX business unit listed as a regulated company. And I'm not myself an expert in FINRA regulations, but perhaps you've got something to say.
No, nor am I. And I think, there's a whole another level to this, which is, all of these regulations assume a certain degree of self-discipline, right? I mean, they assume that you have an auditor, they assume you have internal controls, they assume you have ways to check and double check against conflicts of interest. They assume there's a certain degree of independence of the board, that you have a board of directors, that there's certain independence, there's an element of independence involved. I mean, there's so many different layers to this. And even the law firms, I guess there are a couple of different law firms, my old law firm, Fenwick & West, as well as a couple of other big law firms that were all helping FTX and were proud of the success story. So obviously the websites mentioned FTX, and it's quite a thing now that have those firms have to remove any reference to FTX because there's reputational harm now of being associated with FTX. It's a negative thing just to see that association. So of course the websites can all be updated and the deletions can all be made, but the historical record is clear that multiple U.S. firms were helping this business during the 3+ years of its growth cycle and the monies that it was raising over that period of time. And I guess to some degree, the question becomes, what did those law firms know and when did they know it about what was going on? And did they have some duty to police the level or lack of level of internal controls that existed? I mean, those questions are going to be raised. And essentially anyone that helped FTX is going to potentially be a target for litigation, or for at least questioning in litigation that's filed.
The devil is in the details in all these potential litigation scenarios. One thing that I wonder about is the scope of FTX's activities and the international jurisdiction over it all. If a company reaches 500 or 2,000 shareholders within the USA, then it starts falling into SEC public regulation rules, with which I'm slightly familiar, having filed SEC filings myself. There's really a question of at what point does a private company that's based in Bermuda become subject to these U.S. regulators? It is, for example, an auditor who does an audit report on private companies. Do they have legal responsibility to the same level of legal responsibility to investors that they would if it were a public filing?
Right. So we have this very big picture from 30,000 feet in the air that seems as though there has been, at least in the news, what seems to be a massive amount of financial loss in various ventures that are under the control of a CEO that's sort of young, that's brash, that's out to change the world. And, there's examples in Theranos, which is now an old story. There's examples with FTX, which is now a very current story. These companies grow very quickly, are able to attract capital, are able to get big valuations. And then all of a sudden, when it's time to really prove that there is a real business, something happens that the truth, or opens the door to the truth. And there's this, massive uncovering. Now, in the case of Theranos, it was a fairly detailed investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal who uncovered the fraud and wrote articles about it, and ultimately wrote a book and a podcast about it, and became a movie, and obviously played into the success of the prosecution. In the case of FTX, it looks almost more like there was some series of events that happened that obviously caused Bitcoin, BTC, ETH, and other cryptocurrencies to lose substantial value. At the height, I think BTC was like $64,000 a Bitcoin, and it's, I think, sunk as low as maybe 16,000, or even below that, maybe even down to 12,000. So obviously there's the psychology of the market that changes, and to some degree there's a lot of volatility there. And then the question becomes, how much leverage exists, and where's all this money that ultimately was being invested and used in ways that should have actually benefited the company? Did someone end up making a lot of money here and hiding it and saying that there was some sort of hack or loss that they couldn't control. I don't know that story. I think we're going to learn it over some period of time. We're going to learn what actually happened. And was it just a change in psychology where all the various investors just punched the exit button like a bank run all at the same time, right? This history is going to be revealed, or these facts are going to be revealed, however painfully long it takes to reveal them. And I suppose the civil and criminal litigation processes will play out. In the case of Theranos, I think it took about a 5 or 6 year period to get to where we are today, which is obviously a couple of convictions, a jail sentence for the CEO and founder, certainly a jail sentence coming for the COO, and arguably he's close to a co-founder, although he wasn't there at the actual very beginning. He came in later, and he put some of his own cash in. So he actually, in his view, he actually lost money. But I lump these two cases together because they seem to be examples.
Jack, looking at this all with the perspective of having done audit work in the past, I ask myself how frauds like this can go on so long unreported. Why none of the potential investors who came in and said, I'm not investing, this is a fraud, why did they not then contact law enforcement? I remember one of the other recent the other frauds within the last 2 decades. I'm not sure you're familiar with the Volkswagen emissions scandal.
Yes, I am. Yes.
They tamed the emissions in certain cars, diesel cars, right, so that they could tell when they were being smog tested and changed modes from the normal high smog mode into a special test mode to fake the test results.
Right.
And there were people within the company, engineers who developed this, who were fully aware that who met every element of that fraud definition that we discussed. There were owners of the VW diesel cars who were boasting on the internet as far back as 2008 about how incredibly high gas mileage they were getting. They were boasting that my diesel VW gets 80 miles per gallon. So why didn't the audit firm PwC go out and notice these internet posts saying I get 80 miles per gallon? Isn't that clear evidence that there's something askew? Why didn't any of the VW owners contact the authorities and say, hey, how can I possibly get such high gas mileage readings? Is there something illegal or fraudulent about these tests? So really, what's the incentive? Why don't we have more whistleblowers is my summary question.
Yeah, I think it's the general attitude of most people that there's risk in being a whistleblower. There's, reputational risk if you're wrong. There's financial risk if you get sued. There's, by the company or by somebody else who's out to protect whatever interest there is. I mean, look at what happened in the Theranos case. The son of one of the board members, Schultz, who lived until age 99, George Schultz, had a grandson who ended up working there after graduating from college, and he saw what was wrong, and he wanted to whistleblow, and he went to his parents, he went to his grandfather, and I think his parents believed him, but I think his grandfather just shooed him away and said, no, you don't really know. You don't know what the truth is. You're too low in the organization. So, they get discouraged. And, we did change, the U.S. did change its trade secret law to say that if you're a whistleblower, you're allowed to disclose trade secrets of your employer in the context of a whistleblower filing or a whistleblower disclosure. And that didn't previously exist as a statutory exception, but in the Defend Trade Secrets Act, the federal legislation that federalized trade secret law, not exclusively, but it is used as a tool, and it does set a certain precedent. There is a carve-out that says, look, if an employee uses trade secrets to do a whistleblowing activity, that's not trade secret misappropriation, and you can't condemn the employee. But in the case of Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz, he was hounded and pursued aggressively by the corporate law firm, David Bowie's law firm, in a trade secret filing that they made against him on the view that he shouldn't be disclosing information. And they, there's a whole part of the movie, the miniseries that ran that really graphically portrays what happened to him. And, ultimately he was fired, and, he went on a recent podcast to say he was a little upset that the jury didn't find that Elizabeth Holmes also defrauded the patients, because he was worried more about the patients than the investors. She was able to get off of the claim of the charges of patient fraud. And he was like, I was more worried about the patients than I was about the investors. The investors, they're just losing money. The patients could have lost their lives. So it's kind of interesting. I think there's a lot of reasons people don't go out of their way and don't do things that you would say should be doable. Now, maybe there needs to be in an anonymous way, but anonymous submissions can also be used wrongfully. So it's when you have an anonymous submission, how do you evaluate that? But maybe there is some solution to this that should exist, because I agree with you. The signs are usually, in retrospect, a lot clearer, and you just have to be aware of being able to see them. And they were there for Theranos. They were likely there for FTX as well. And they were likely there for other situations where fraud was eventually uncovered, probably like Enron and WorldCom and all the other, Bernie Madoff. I mean, we could list the big ones, right? I mean, they're so memorable, one after the other after the other.
So do you see any specific changes that would, from a general standpoint, whether it be educational changes or regulatory changes, that would help to prevent future frauds?
Yeah, and look, I think what's going to happen is, at a high level, there's many, many people that are going to be discouraged to imagine a digital currency. I mean, the one thing FTX has done is brought some degree of skepticism back to the table about whether we're going to get to a cashless society or what might be called even a bank-free society, because cryptocurrencies literally, at their purest level, get rid of intermediaries, get rid of banks. And this idea of not having a trusted intermediary is a big idea. And you have to be able to trust that the underlying system can operate in a way that's reliable. And I think this failure of the exchange, FTX as an exchange, is going to effectively cause a lot of skepticism that we can move into a world of digital payments. Now, we know that in China, most payments are digital payments, and they're typically through either WeChat, through a cell phone operator. So it's, there's still a trusted intermediary there, but it's all handled electronically. So your cell phone is essentially your wallet, and you can make payments. And I think most Chinese use either WeChat or Alipay or one or the other of these major services that are out there. I don't know what FTX ultimately will mean for the credibility of moving towards what I would say is this more cashless model, but I'm sure it's going to have a major impact. And I'm sure that it's going to result in some real rethinking. At the same time, I do think we'll probably see a whole new layer of federal legislation and maybe even state legislation as well that will be designed to impose some additional disclosure requirements on companies like FTX. And where if another FTX arises, and it's hard to believe that'll happen quickly, but hey, you know, we survived the dot-com crashes, and there's still a lot of dot-com businesses that are being created and being funded, even though there's a lot of failures. So in the failure, there's a lot of learning. And my guess is if Sam Bankman-Cohen survives this individually, he'll probably start a new business and get funded, because that's the U.S. mentality, which is it's all a big learning adventure. Elizabeth Holmes, she might get out of jail in 10 years or so and start a new biotech company. It's not unheard of.
Well, Jack, they both have fascinating stories. And as a volunteer on the program committee for FEI Silicon Valley, I'd be delighted to have either of these people as a speaker at one of our events, if they're listening.
Well, you probably have to wait for Elizabeth Holmes to get out of jail. I guess she's reporting in April of 2023, the judge allowed her that extension because she's pregnant with their second child. I mean, kind of an amazing story that she went to her hearing to hear the decision on the her sentencing hearing. And she's like 6 months pregnant. And so, you know, it's got to be an amazing aspect for a judge who then said, well, you can report starting in April of 2023, is allowing her to report to a facility that is, you know, sort of less restrictive in Texas. So he obviously doesn't see her as a real risk. And I assume she'll write a book and maybe do a number of other things while in jail. I mean, she has rights of appeal. Now, whether he's going to somehow stay the sentence pending the appeal, that seems very unlikely to me. The flip side question is, here's a guy, Sam Bankman-Cohen, who lost a lot more money, arguably for a lot more many people, albeit most of them are overseas. And is he actually going to get charged with a crime? Is he actually going to face, I mean, he's already been filed, suits have already been filed against him, class action cases have already been filed against him. So there are civil suits, but will those give rise to a criminal investigation? Will there be criminal charges? Where will they be brought, given that he's not in the U.S.? So if the criminal acts occurred overseas. And so it's, in theory, it's still territorial jurisdiction, even though he caused harm in the U.S. The crime was committed overseas.
What are the penalties for theft or fraud in Barbados?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I would imagine that if, you know, Barbados kind of sees him as the kind of entrepreneur they want to attract, who can grow big businesses pretty quickly and, you know, bring capital into the country and employ people and rent offices and do all the things that companies do, I would imagine they would take a different view than the U.S. might take if he were to locate in the U.S. I doubt that he's going to want to set foot on U.S. territory, but, you know, who knows? I mean, maybe ultimately he feels like he did nothing wrong here. I mean, to some degree, he probably just feels like this grew too fast and, you know, we didn't really have the level of control that we needed to have.
You've touched on so many issues. I know that in one of your emails, you mentioned a potential conflict of interest for the Boyce law firm. Did you want to expand on that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I went through and I sent to you, and you looked at, because you gave me your comments on the expert witness that the government is using in the Holmes case, because the judge has to set a restitutionary amount, which is theoretically the amount that Holmes is supposed to also pay to make restitution, not pay the government, but more like pay into the court so the court can disperse to various victims some, pro rata amount of money. And there's an expert that was hired as kind of the financial analyst to put together a report of what the opinion is about what the total loss was to these investors. Now, the question becomes, what do you use to make that judgment? Do you use the cash that they put in at the original cash basis? Do you use the value of the appreciated stock that they held and the fact that that all went to zero? I mean, what do you use? Because there still are assets. I mean, Theranos is in bankruptcy. They have lots of patents. They likely have lots of office chairs and desks and stuff in storage, equipment, hardware, and computers and servers and monitors and lamps and everything else that goes with running a lab in an office, probably tons of lab equipment. I mean, all that stuff is eventually going to get sold off in bankruptcy and liquidated. And there'll be some cash. I don't know what the net will be after all the administrative costs and all the legal fees and all the expert witness costs. But somewhere in this, that plays a role in figuring out what the loss is, because obviously the cash did go into a certain degree of company infrastructure, including hundreds and hundreds of patents. And the point I made about the David Boies and the Boies firm potential conflict of interest, if not actual conflict of interest, is the schedules of investors show that they were investors, both David Boies himself individually, as well as the law firm. And so they were supposed to be giving, and maybe they did give, neutral, disinterested, objective, independent advice. But someone could raise questions about, hey, they were investors. They wanted to see their stock grow in value. They wanted to see this business continue to have a very high value. Their investments occurred relatively early at relatively low values. I mean, to some degree, that's why some law firms won't invest, and some firms will only invest and take non-voting shares, or will put the shares in a blind trust, or will otherwise try to separate their interest in the success of the client, which is, I think, a good thing, from any notion that they actually, are somehow in a real conflict of interest. I mean, they didn't have a huge number of shares from an overall percentage point of view, but at $9 billion of value, I'm going to bet that their shares were probably worth in the millions. So it wasn't a trivial investment, and they lost that investment. And so, oddly, they are also claimants against the assets of the estate. I'm sure they probably are owed legal fees as well and lots of other things. But yeah, conceptually, it raises so many other issues because there's so much going on in that case, and I'm sure there's going to be a similar number of issues that get raised in the FTX case. And, we've lumped together two cases that are in two completely different industries because the losses are pretty substantial in the billions with a capital B. So it's not in any way a minor spectacle. It's a major spectacle. And it says something about what's happening in the world right now, or maybe what's been happening in the world over perhaps the last 10 or so, maybe even the last 20 or so years. So that's kind of the interesting big picture. So I think we should keep our eye on what happens and check in from time to time, because I do think there's a bit of a pattern that's emerging here. And I don't know what it will ultimately end up meaning in the big picture. I think you made a very keen observation that the Trump leadership and examples, and particularly all the stuff that's now coming out against him, although today or yesterday, he won a case against one of his relatives in New York involving the estate of his father. So he got a rare win today in a case that involved the father's granddaughter from his brother Robert, who was deceased. And the granddaughter was claiming that a major fraud had occurred with respect to her father's and therefore her share of the estate. So yeah, you have to wonder, maybe it is right from the symbolism at the top. Maybe that observation really says it all to some degree.
Jack, I'd like to mention two things. First of all, there's potential tax implications and tax fraud implications in all of these cases. The IRS does have a whistleblower program, and somebody who provides insider information regarding a tax fraud can actually be rewarded by a relatively small percentage of the funds recovered by the IRS. I'm not aware of any such claims in these cases, but it may be years until we find out whether, until the dust settles. Now, you mentioned China and also the transactional use of cryptocurrency. In my experience preparing tax returns, and I prepared thousands of tax returns and resolved hundreds of disputes between taxpayers and the tax authorities, I have not once seen anybody who buys their coffee at Starbucks using crypto.
Yeah, that doesn't exist yet here, but it's starting to exist in other countries.
You mentioned electronic transfer, and we do have electronic payment systems here in the U.S. That have different names, PayPal, for example, but and EFT transfers and a whole slew of electronic funds, but they're basically fiat-based in large part, not crypto-based. I think there's a false argument out there that crypto transfer fees are lower than credit card transfer fees. So you see credit card fees in the 3% range. And some people are saying, well, a Bitcoin purchase is free. But those people neglect to look at the bid-ask spread for crypto. It's very hard to exchange Bitcoin to fiat currency. And there's going to be a substantial bid-ask spread that, in my experience, is far more than 3%. And I think that's often overlooked. So anybody listening to this, please realize that crypto is essentially, in practice, as I see it, a highly speculative investment where you can lose a lot of money as well as make a lot of money. And it should not be played with by the faint of heart or people who can't afford to lose their principal.
Right. It's certainly far more speculative than buying silver or buying gold, but even people would say you could buy gold and silver and maybe they drop in value significantly because somehow new mines are opened or new sources are found or the world shifts in a different direction. I mean, the gold standard was the standard years ago. It's not really the standard anymore. And we do have what are called fiat currencies at this point. But in general, it's highly speculative, and all of those accredited investors, including those overseas, are supposed to be able to bear their losses. Now, it doesn't justify fraud, just like VC firms lost money in Theranos, but they would say we didn't think we were being defrauded. And so even they have rights of recovery. But in general, I think you're absolutely right. I think this is an area where, to some degree, the accredited investors have to put some of the onus on their own due diligence or their own lack of asking, well, where is the CFO? Who is the auditor? What are the levels of insurance you have? What are the fiduciary practices? Who are the board members? Who is the independent board member? Just a whole list of standard questions that try to assure that someone is minding the cash register and that there's an audit trail, right?
Excellent questions.
Right. So thanks, Steve, for coming on. I think this has been helpful. We'll keep our eye on this because there's a thread that involves this very, very high level question of what's happening in the world at an extremely high level, 30,000 feet in the air, as it were, where you can look at all these cases as starting to demonstrate a post sort of, I don't know what we want to call it, post-modern or certainly post-2000 revolution. Maybe it's a revolution in electronics, but there is a form of revolution that is causing revolutionary individuals to do revolutionary things, some with success, some with failure, and some with fraud. And how to define or distinguish between the three may be difficult. And then there's much more detailed examination of the machinery of what went wrong and what does the post-mortem reveal. And, that declaration that I distributed of the expert witness in the Theranos case, it really does sort of reveal the post-mortem of how quickly Theranos grew and how much money they raised over how many different rounds of capital raising, and who became the shareholders and what their stakes became, and what it meant to have a $9 billion valuation on a company that really had no material revenue. It had some predictions and projections, but it really hadn't even gotten to really a revenue generating company. Because they were still developing a product that ultimately proved to be a ginormous fraudulent failure. So probably never could have succeeded unless somehow there was a breakthrough in the lab that really enabled something to happen that up to that point just couldn't happen. I think that's what Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani would say that they were expecting to occur. The magic of Silicon Valley is you put a number of engineers on a project and you allow them to work hard, and they do. And sometimes magic comes out as a result, and great successes like the iPhone, the original Macintosh, the original Apple II computer all get generated as a result. So thanks for coming on, Steve. I'll ping you from time to time. How can people reach you if they need help in the area of tax preparation, accounting, and you do expert witness work as well? So why don't you give your email address and phone number and website?
Indeed. So my email is srabin, S for Steve, Rabin, R-A-B as in Bravo, I-N, at srabin.com. My cell phone is 408-887-4433. And my website, www.taxservice2u, the number 2 and the letter u.com.
I'm Jay Russo, J-R-U-S-S-O, at computerlaw.com. 650-327-9800. And I can be reached typically more quickly these days by email than by phone, but the phone works and you can get me there. And there's lots of other ways to contact through the website, which is computerlaw.com as well. Thanks, Steve. Thanks for coming on. Take care. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.